morning, everyone. Welcome to our Western Energy Imbalance Market Resource Efficiency Evaluation Enhancement Phase 1 Emergency Action Criteria Workshop here at the ISO. My name is Brenda Corona, here with the Stakeholder Affairs Group. Here I will be facilitating today's meeting, and I'm also joined by Danny Johnson at the California ISO. Before we begin the meeting, I would like to provide you some updates and reminders about this presentation. All related materials will be found on the Stakeholder Initiative page, and also this video will be recorded and will be posted publicly on the initiative page as well. Make sure that any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. These calls are structured to stimulate dialogue and engage different perspectives and keep comments brief, professional, and respectful. We will pause at the end of the meeting for questions for this presentation. As well, you may raise your hand or using the chat window by using the audio to press #2 on your device. If you do experience any technical assistance in today's meeting, please send a chat to our event producer or myself, and we will help you. But please remember to state your name and affiliation of your company first before making a comment, and we will go ahead and begin this meeting with Danny Johnson from Market Infrastructure Policy. Danny?
Yeah, thank you, Brenda. So we're here today to have a workshop on emergency action criteria. This is a follow-up to the Phase 1 WEIM Resource Efficiency Evaluation Phase 1. For a little background before diving into this issue, I want to reiterate that in Phase 1, we attempted to design a backstop that would prevent continued incremental participation during mutually agreed upon instances of resource insufficiency. This was in response to feedback we received from stakeholders to try to limit the complexity of the test. The idea is that designing an RSE for every potential boundary condition can make the test more unwieldy and more difficult to engage with. So rather than doing that, a backstop would be provided that would allow entities to notify the broader EIM community when they would be passing the resource sufficiency evaluation erroneously and would be able to limit their incremental participation. This really was raised on some of the analysis and reporting that was done from the August 2020 events as well as the July of 2021 events where certain DAAs may have passed the resource sufficiency evaluation when they were clearly resource insufficient. We think that the Phase 1 enhancements that were taken to the February joint governance meeting will go a long way to reducing the possibility for those types of erroneous passings of the RSE to occur. However, we still think there is value in seeing if we can design some type of common backstop that would prevent continued EIM participation during clear demonstrations of resource insufficiency. So this was stakeholdered in the first phase of this initiative. We received comments in our revised draft final proposal, which really highlighted a diverse set of opinions on what constitutes resource insufficiency and what would be an appropriate metric for resource insufficiency. For this reason, we actually removed this element from the enhancement proposal that we took that February joint governance meeting to try to bring this back to the stakeholder process, to this workshop specifically to see if we can coalesce around what would be a good metric to have this automatic failure occur on, given that in the last iteration of the proposal, again, there was not really consensus within the stakeholder community. So based on this, we've kind of identified 3 different potential options for how this could be handled. I was going to walk through each of these options and kind of list from the ISO's perspective what we would see as the benefits or limitations of each option. However, we really intend this to be a workshop format, so I encourage everybody to please raise your hand, please comment, and we're trying to identify and get everybody's thoughts on this issue to see if we can arrive at any consensus that would allow us to implement this type of backstop in a near or midterm timeframe. So the first option is what the ISO originally proposed in its policy proposal, and this would be to have the backstop be triggered upon agreed upon system operator actions that correspond to resource insufficiency. The comments we received in the policy proposal show that there was pretty widespread agreement that the actions that the ISO specifically took of dispatching its reserves and backfilling those reserves with firm load did constitute resource insufficiency. The advantage of trying to use operator actions is that these operator actions would be agreed upon by all the stakeholders. It also maintains a separation between the ability to participate in a voluntary market and the reliability coordinator function, which we found important. The negatives is that all actions that could be taken may not be identified when this policy would go into place. So our thought was we'd have some tariff provisions that would kind of lay a framework of when this would occur and then would be able to define additional actions as they come up through the BPM process. This received some support, but there were a number of stakeholders who didn't agree with this approach and thought it was a little bit too open-ended and was not standardized enough. So the next option that we heard from stakeholders was the concept of utilizing the Nerf EEA classifications as predefined metrics that would be signifiers of resource insufficiency. We heard two different options that have been offered. These would be utilizing the Nerf EEA 2 and the Nerf EEA 3 definitions. I've listed the definitions on the slide, and I'd like to take a minute to walk through them because I think this may be where a significant portion of our discussion occurs. So for an EEA 2, it signifies that load management procedures are in effect. The first bullet states that a BAA is no longer able to provide its expected energy requirements and is an energy deficient BAA. This, as far as I understand, is not a NERC-defined term, an energy deficient BAA. The next bullet says that the energy deficient BAA has implemented operating plans to mitigate emergencies. I think these likely come in the form of load management procedures, so demand response programs that are designed to be used during tight supply conditions. The third bullet is that an energy deficient BA is still able to maintain its contingency reserve requirements, which means that it's able to continually reliably meet its obligations under the NERC and WEC paradigms. For a EEA3, this is when firm load interruption is imminent or in progress. So the balancing authority area would be unable to meet its contingency reserves. This harkens back to what we talked about on that previous slide when contingency reserves were dispatched as energy and backfilled by firm load. From the ISO's perspective, that type of action would fall under an EEA3. Does anybody have any questions on the definitions? Okay, hearing none. For the implications of using the NERC definitions, let's start on the EEA2. It is a standardized definition, so it does provide that assurance across the entire EIM footprint that everybody would have the same trigger, which would be in this case an EEA2. From the ISO's perspective, there are potential problems with utilizing an EEA2. This really gets to the utilization of load management procedures. I think an example from the ISO's perspective is that the reliability demand response product, which is a forward contracted RA product in the ISO, is designed to really be used during as kind of a resource of last resort. It's not designed to be normally used during normal operating conditions. For this reason, it has some pretty high bid-in values. I think it's bid-in at a minimum of $950. And it's actually tied to the declaration of an EEA2. So when we thought about potentially utilizing an EEA2, this again created issues, at least from the ISO, because the ISO could potentially be locked out of incremental EIM participation while it still had significant volume, and by this I mean over 1,000 megawatts of forward contracted RA supply. I don't know if this issue is limited to the ISO or if this is broader. I know the different LRAs and different PUCs have set up the demand response programs that are intended to be used during tight or stressed system conditions in different ways, but I'd be interested in hearing if this is an ISO-only problem or if or if other entities who utilize emergency type demand response programs may rely on or may run into similar issues. The other issue that we saw with this, getting back to that DR, is to the extent that those programs aren't triggered by an EEA2, it could lead to an asymmetric ability for EIM entities to utilize their demand response programs. As part of the phase 1 policy enhancements, we are actually looking to allow EIM entities to make demand response or to reflect their demand response programs in the forecast that they're tested against for the RSC. So in effect, they're able to represent their demand response programs with very little oversight other than an acknowledgement that they're going to try to accurately represent them. And so implementing and using an EEA2 to limit incremental participation could lead to, I guess, one set of EIM entities being able to utilize their emergency demand response programs and continue to participate in the EIM while another set would have more limitations on that. I see a question in the queue. Can we go to Lindsay?
Sure, give me one moment. Your line's unmuted. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Lindsay Flickway with NV Energy. Danny, I have just a quick question to go back just a little bit. I'm confused. So are you stating that it sounds like we're moving forward with the idea to fail an EIM entity if they're in an emergency event or if they're in a defined, whatever we determine, however to define this, that if they are short, that we would fail them so that they suffer the consequences of failing this resource efficiency test. Is that correct?
So I think if we could table that for a minute, I have another slide that kind of gets to that. I wouldn't say that we are necessarily going to do that. I think the idea is that if there is broad consensus within the stakeholder community that is a reasonable thing to do, and we can agree upon the criteria, we would then look to implement that type of policy.
Okay, I'm sorry, I jumped ahead then. Okay, all right, that answers my question. Thank you.
Thanks, Lindsay.
We do have another question if you want to take that one.
Yeah, sure. I see Laura in the queue.
Hi, Danny. Laura Trelease from BPA. It seems like we might be mixing up issues here. I think the first question is a BA resource insufficient, or when do you define a BA being resource insufficient as a backstop? And the second one, you moved slides, is freezing transfers.
I thought this would help. Yeah.
Is freezing transfers in an emergency situation reasonable? I think this you could add it to the first option as well, that if the criteria is that you fail a BA when they're taking specific emergency actions, and that's resulting in a freezing of transfers, that BA is still in an emergency situation and you have the same con there. It begs the same question. So it almost seems like the criteria for failing a BA is being swayed by what the failure consequences are. And I think maybe you just can't have this discussion one without the other. We still maintain that when we're talking about accuracy of the test, the goal is that the RSC accurately evaluates the operating capability and obligations of each BA. And I know we've stated our position several times that we believe that when a BA is in an EEA2, that BA is energy deficient and therefore resource insufficient. But I think that we have to wrestle with this secondary question about, okay, so if they're resource insufficient and they're in an emergency situation, is freezing transfers the right consequence, and what other unintended consequences are in place? And so maybe if we could tease out the issues a little bit, that might help the discussion.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, Laura. Which one would you want to start on? Do we start on that? Is it appropriate to even freeze transfers, or start on what the criteria would be?
Well, I think we could probably, maybe it makes sense to start with the second, because it almost feels like we can't quite talk about the criteria without talking about, is it appropriate to freeze transfers?
Okay, sure. I think that makes sense. And you are right that this kind of is freezing transfers in an emergency situation. A good outcome is inherent to the other option of just using emergency action. So I'm sure we may jump back to those previous couple slides, but this slide kind of highlights that there was a group of stakeholders who opposed this concept if not considered in conjunction with financial failure consequences. So right now the RSC is designed to not allow a BAA to cure a real-time energy shortfall through the capacity of other BAAs. I think this is what is commonly been understood and referred to as leaning. This additional capacity would then be procured within the EIM or Western interconnection footprint bilaterally through emergency energy assistance rather than essentially cleared market. I think what you were getting at, Laura, and then I think the feedback we heard from a number of stakeholders is that there might be a better way to do this and to try to reconsider this paradigm and see if the EIM could be utilized to cure these type of capacity deficiencies. I see Dan has a question in the queue.
Hey, thanks, Danny. Dan Williams from Customized Energy Solutions. I wasn't intending to cut you off on this slide before you got through things. I was just kind of queuing up for a comment later, but since I'm here, I just felt like in listening to the conversation at the board meeting or the joint session meeting, I guess I should say, and even from the MSC meeting, that a little bit of the context seems to be getting lost in the discussion of these options, and that context is around just the mechanics of the RSE and how we're not talking about taking transfers to zero. We're talking about taking them to the last good level. And I believe based on the data that the CAISO's presented and now that DMM is presenting, that there, in most of these instances for the CAISO, that level of transfers is still quite high from previous intervals as you're moving across the more critical evening ramp periods. And I believe even for the EIM entities, it was fairly consistent too. But it feels like more discussion of that or just putting in context of that needs to be there as we're discussing this. And then I think the other thing too, which I'm not sure that we've discussed, is just when thinking about the timing of the failure, talking about what opportunity operators, whether it's CAISO operators or the EIMBA operators, have at that point for getting additional capacity either from the other EIM areas or from elsewhere still exists, purchases at the ties, exceptional dispatch, those sorts of things, as ways to cure that insufficiency without needing the EIM transfers, if that makes sense. So just wanted to offer those two thoughts and see where that fits in the conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. So on the first point about, you are right that the transfers, the incremental transfers are limited. So that the existing transfers at the time of failure would occur naturally through the RSC or through this type of backstop mechanism. The transfers would be limited to that value. You are right that the ISO through reporting has been shown to have significant transfers when this occurs. Our sense is that this relates to the way CAISO clears exports, potentially through seeing advisory EIM transfers or through imports. And so I think to fully understand that and the level of transfers and why they're high when the ISO fails, we still have to unwind that, which I know is part of the analysis that Guillermo and his team are doing as part of phase 1B. So that's something that I don't think we'll be able to address prior to the policy development after that analysis is concluded. So I guess jumping.
just before jumping to the next one, so is the concern there that maybe if some policy changes around that interplay between exports in HASS clearing against the advisory EIM transfers, that CAISO may then end up being in a position where incremental transfers are significantly maybe lower at different times where you're in tight system conditions, and therefore freezing the transfers could have a more significant impact on the CAISO or potentially on other VAs if that policy changes?
I think it depends on what those changes look like, because if the changes would limit the exports that are potentially enabled by those types of transfers, then you might see kind of lower transfers in, but also a lower requirement. So a lower export obligation that the CAISO would be trying to backfill. So it might not be as problematic. I think when you start considering financial consequences for maybe the entire volume of the transfers in excess of zero, then we would definitely need to have that type of analysis in place, because to the extent that exports are getting cleared out of the CAISO based off those advisory transfers, exposing the CAISO in particular to severe financial penalties to try to get those incremental EIM transfers that then help to allow those exports to occur that occurred in the HASS might not be a good outcome. And then I think the second point you made is the volume of bilateral emergency energy assistance. I think it still exists. I think one of the points that NVE made to us, which really struck home, is like the WEIM is a really significant portion of the Western interconnection. So a lot of the excess capacity is being offered into the EIM, which could in effect make the bilateral markets where these resource insufficiencies could get cured a little more stretched or a little tighter. So that is something we're keeping in mind. Which is,
yeah, thanks.
I think,
and I think
yeah.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, it gets back to the issue that the MSC tried to highlight, and then a few of the governing body members and CAISO board members highlighted is maybe it does make sense to figure out how we could try to cure these insufficiencies through the EIM, since in a lot of cases the excess capacity is there in the EIM. It's just a question of how do we price it accordingly.
Okay, great, thanks. Yeah, and that definitely becomes a different question too when we transition into EDAM as well, and just where we expect the markets to be in the future. Just my thought went to the timing on it, and whether there was still time for CAISO operators to make out-of-market purchases at the ties as a way to maintain reliability if the incremental need was above what the last good transfer value was. But thanks for exploring that a little further.
Sure, Dan. And my understanding is there is still time to do that. I think the reliability question comes up depending upon the volume of megawatts that have to be made up through that process in that short time horizon. So on this slide, the pros of, I guess, waiting to consider this in concert with financial consequences is it would leverage the WEIM for this type of emergency energy assistance to the extent that you take those transfers out of the bilateral market and the dollaring or the dialing for megawatt paradigm. I think it could serve to increase reliability, since it's just an easier mechanism to allow a resource insufficient BAA to access that additional capacity. I think the cons on this approach are largely the reason that this initiative got bifurcated into two phases in the first place, and it's just that how those consequences would be implemented, how they would be funded, how their revenue allocation would occur, may require, and we think will require, significant policy development. There also is an underlying potential that could lead to disincentives to procure sufficient forward capacity if the financial consequences aren't set at the right level. I know this is something that the MSC has brought up, that a $2,000 penalty for an hour may be a good outcome to avoid putting steel in the ground for a BAA, and we wouldn't want the EIM to serve that function and prevent or disincentivize BAAs from doing adequate forward procurement. So we tend to, or we'd like to proceed a little bit cautiously as we go down this path. I know that I've had NVE reached out to us with an idea about how this could work, and I wanted to give them an opportunity through this workshop to socialize that idea and see if the broader community thinks that this would be a path forward that we could implement in the near or the midterm. And then I think after we've had that conversation, I'd go back to Stuart Kelly because I see his hand raised in the queue. Lindsay, are you there?
Hey, Donnie, can you just recap, because we've had a lot of discussion on maybe emergency actions, financial consequences, even mention at EDAM. Are you basically, is this focused on trying to give CAISO the ability to not freeze transfers and recognizing that there's the potential that may or may not, or should, potentially include some kind of financial penalty? Are you trying to basically have CAISO not freeze the transfers in an emergency without having full consideration of financial consequences and everything that's been tabled for phase 2? Is that what you're trying to do here?
I think the idea is to explore if there's a way that we can price that emergency energy assistance through the EIM. I think it makes sense to do that through phase 2. We want to be open to all ideas, so if there's a way to do this outside of phase 2 to get it implemented quicker, we would be open to that. But really this gets back to, I think, what Laura brought up is there are two separate questions here. Is it reasonable to have, I think freezing transfers is what it is. That's the rule right now. That's what we do. The question is that reasonable? Is that something we want to change? And then the second question is, if we do want to have some type of backstop provision that limits the incremental transfers, what would be the criteria?
But you're basically trying to, I recognize the points that's been made and what Laura stated, but you're basically trying to have the phase 2 discussion now to see if there's something that can be put in place. And if not, is there some kind of backstop? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. The goal is to see, is there some type of truncated, smaller version of phase 2 that we can get widespread agreement on that could be implemented before we launch into the full phase 2 policy development. To the extent there is, great. I think we could try to proceed down that path. To the extent there isn't, is it worthwhile to have a trigger that would automatically freeze transfers to prevent entities from passing when they're actually resource insufficient in that interim period between now and when that phase 2 policy development occurs?
But was that not proposed by some of the entities and CAISO pushed back on a phase 1A or 1B, whatever, however it was described, and now we're back to trying to consider it?
We put this out in the issue paper, and we highlighted that going through and trying to design financial consequences that don't have unintended consequences and have good cost causation principles is not going to be a straightforward process. And the feedback that the ISA received at that time is, yeah, let's focus on getting the accuracy enhancements in place first in the RSC. And then once those are in place, in a second phase, have that discussion. I think the idea was not to bog down and prevent accuracy enhancements from going in while that discussion was occurring. So this is a little bit broaching on that decision. It's more to see if there's something in the middle before we have that full phase 2 discussion that could be implemented.
I recognize what you're saying, Danny, but I think it's more in line with what was originally proposed. The folks were trying to keep things going rather than wait for a full phase 2, and that's helpful. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Stuart.
Hi, I think I'm unmuted now. Danny, can you hear me?
Yeah. Hi, Lindsay.
Hi. So Lindsay Schluckway from NV Energy again. We wanted to put forth kind of our high-level principles and proposal for this financial option. First, I just wanted to say that we're appreciative of having a separate stakeholder initiative for this consideration, and that our primary goal for this stakeholder initiative is to hopefully develop something that is very simple and an EIM energy assistance program that could preferably be implemented relatively quickly, or at least hopefully get something in place prior to this summer. And I did want to at least point out that with the increasing number of entities that have joined the EIM, there's less and less supply available in the bilateral market, and so we believe that time is now to kind of develop this EIM energy assistance program. So I'd like to put forth the following high-level principles and proposal for future stakeholder discussion. So first, we believe that an EIM energy assistance program should be entirely optional, and that an EIM should operate as it does today for any EIM entity that does not elect to utilize the program. And as for number 2 of our proposal, we'd like to put forth that the market operator should run a test prior to each hour to ensure that there is enough market availability in order to provide this option of the EIM Energy Assistance Program in real time to EIM entities so that there's enough available supply. And then provided that this condition is met, then we believe that the resource sufficiency test, if a resource sufficiency test failure occurred, then an EIM entity would have an option to receive EIM imports above the current capped threshold at a price of $2,000 per megawatt. And we believe that the market should prioritize EIM transactions to the EIM entities that pass the resource sufficiency test, and that the EIM entity that fails the resource sufficiency test and elects to receive imports should be the first cut in a real-time, if a real-time shortage occurs within the market. The price for the program should be high enough to prevent leaning, which should be monitored by the DMM. And the expectation for this program is that it would only be utilized when absolutely necessary for reliability. Our last principle for this is that the EIM Energy Assistance Program should be settled out of the market to provide payments to generators that are responsible for the energy, or to EIM entities that pass the test if it is not possible to determine the generator that responded. This uplift or out-of-market settlement should be settled directly with the EIM entities for further allocation. And additionally, we should also consider utilizing current uplift charge codes that already exist to minimize any complexities, if at all possible. And then in closing, we believe that no market rule should create a reliability issue or increase the probability of an emergency event by cutting EIM entities out of the market in real time when transactions are needed the most. With more and more entities joining the EIM, it is paramount that we develop a simple solution to allow energy assistance. And then that's all I had, Danny, for our proposal.
Okay, thanks, Lindsay. I think my initial take, at least, would be that the ISO would agree with a lot of those principles. I am concerned about our ability to implement that type of program and get the policy development necessary to implement that type of program outside of phase 2 of this initiative. But I would be interested in understanding or hearing from other stakeholders if they have the same impression.
Okay, and I understand that, Danny. Yeah, we were just hoping to see if we could get consensus and develop something that's very simple so that we could get this implemented as quickly as possible.
Okay, thanks, Lindsay. Well, I do see a number of other callers who've jumped in the queue and I think may be interested in commenting on this. So Operator, can we go to Kathleen first? I see her hands up.
Yeah, no, great. Thanks, Danny. And thanks to Lindsay, too. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. Interesting conversation, and I appreciate NV Energy bringing forward a concept, and Danny, you kind of teeing up, is there something in between phase 1 or phase 2 that we could all do? I just wanted to share some thoughts and maybe principles, but a very simple one from Vistra's perspective on this topic, because we've done a little thinking, and we do think it's a complicated effort. So I believe in our written comments, we did support the CAISO deferring it so that we could spend time on it and really think through a lot of these tension points that Danny is flagging. We're on a similar page that this would take a decent amount of time to make sure it worked well. We are conceptually supportive of having the idea that EIM can manage some of these resource insufficiencies that the test might flag through scarcity pricing instead of through capping the transfers. So we are interested in having this conversation, open to doing it now, if this is the right time, like Lindsay is suggesting, and especially if it's a pain point that's really challenging folks, that seems important to us. I think my principle that I'd kind of throw out there as we've been struggling with it is that in concept, doing something makes a lot of sense, but the devil's in the details. And until scarcity pricing is really set up in a way that, because I think some of what I heard you outline, Lindsay, I'm not sure if you're thinking that the pricing for this energy above what would be capped, what otherwise would be capped, would get priced into the LMPs that are published, or if you were thinking of this as a separate kind of out-of-market charge, wasn't quite clear to me as you were talking through it. And I just wanted to throw out for you, from our perspective, it's really important for transparency purposes that scarcity pricing gets reflected in the LMP. So I think that's one of our principles. And if we could kind of keep, I just request folks kind of keep that in mind as we talk through these options, that would be great. One of the other things that we noted that we had some concerns about whether or not we could do this in quick fashion is just if that scarcity pricing isn't sending the right signal, isn't at the right level, not sending the right signals, then it's not effective. And then we might be not, in implementation, it might not result in the outcomes that we're looking for. So I think we just wanted to move slowly through this process to some extent, although if there's something simple that we could do that and process it and come to a place where stakeholders are comfortable with what the price impacts would be, I think that's something worth discussing. Danny or Lindsay, do you have any kind of initial reactions?
Yeah, I think again, we're open to implementing solutions if there's widespread support, when there's widespread support, and we have the technology bandwidth to do it. I think we're at that initial phase of, is there widespread support for this type of issue? Kathleen, you raised a number of good questions of, is this a hurdle rate? Is this an administrative price? Which, again, we identified in the issue proposal. So I think it'd be good to get feedback on that. I think at a minimum, we're going to ask for comments and have some detailed questions about how this could be done. So a worst case, this really sets us up to launch off on phase 2 a little sooner and gives us a good starting point. Maybe there is something that we could implement in the interim. We'd be open to that, but I'd like to see what your response is, Lindsay. Operator, can you unmute Lindsay, please?
Yeah, sorry, I think I'm unmuted now. Okay, can you hear me, Danny?
Yes.
Okay. So Kathleen, thanks for the question. So we were thinking that this would be an out-of-market price signal, and while I do see your point about having an in-market, the reason we were thinking, we've kind of gone back and forth on this. So I think it's definitely open, but the reason we were kind of leaning towards an out-of-market price is to try to make this as simple as possible, at least for the interim, and to allow for the settlements to really go and be paid to generators that maybe are responding to this event or responding to your need for imports, but are not necessarily settled as congestion at the border, so that it could be a payment that could go to another EIM entity. Say, you know, if something occurred in the Southwest, it could go to an entity up in the Northwest that may be actually responding to this, but instead it's being settled as congestion at the border. That's kind of been a concern. So we were trying to think of a kind of a simpler approach, and that's why we've kind of have been leaning towards this. I hope that answers that question.
I think it does, Lindsay, but it raises the concerns that I had originally of why this is in phase 2, is just trying to work out that revenue allocation.
Right.
I think it may take a little bit of time.
Okay.
I think I see Dave Rubin in the queue next. Can we go to Dave?
Hi, Dave Rubin with MV. I mean, Danny, I want to push back a little bit, because the way I understand phase 2 is, at least under your roadmap, it's not slated to be implemented until the fall of 24 at the earliest. That means you've got a reliability issue in your tariff that you're saying won't be addressed until the summer of 2025. And we just think that's unacceptable. And so the question back to the ISO would be, instead of asking us to guess about what you all can do sooner, why don't you at least give us some indication of what you can do? And then we can build around it. We're not opposed to trying to do something on a simpler, implementable basis sooner, and then let phase 2 play out to handle some of the details. But we certainly don't think there's any reason for a reliability risk to be prolonged until phase 2 is complete. That is just completely unacceptable.
Thanks, Dave. I think we've tried to identify through the roadmap what we think we can do. Obviously, the CAISO roadmap is not a static document and is open to changes and being reconsidered as elements arise. I would push back a little bit that this is creating a reliability issue. The whole premise of the EIM is that it's a voluntary market for economic displacement. I think what we're trying to explore is, could it cure an outstanding reliability issue that is there anyway? And I am sensitive to NV's point that the bilateral markets have somewhat dried up, but right now the RSC's and the EIM's design is not to cure a resource insufficiency.
We're talking about voluntarily offered supply that can be made available to handle an emergency. You're basically letting a market rule engage in physical withholding of necessary supply to resolve a potential emergency and then potentially contribute to a blackout. So no, I completely disagree with where you were as far as it doesn't change anything about the voluntary nature of the EIM. It's not changing anything about the need of the resource efficiency test. No EIM entity is going to rely on this for their resource adequacy program because you can't guarantee that the supply will be there. As Lindsay indicated, it would go to the sufficient entities first, so there may not be some. But if there is, there's absolutely no reason to engage in this, sophistry that we're changing the dynamic. We're basically doing what entities do all the time, which is make emergency energy available to a BA in need in the West.
Thanks, Dave. I think we share a similar goal of seeing if we can update the EIM design to let it fill that existing gap in the procurement of emergency supply and move that out of the energy assistance dialing for megawatts paradigm. I know we have Anna on the line from the ISO team, and I think she messaged me that she'd like to make a comment.
Thank you, Danny. I was just listening to the conversation, and I think, I wanted to clarify. I do think that after the last round of changes that we considered and the discussion at the Board of Governors meeting and the governing bodies joint meeting certainly led to the conclusion that, we had to go back and look at something that might be not as intrusive, if you wish, with regards to potentially cutting off, transfers during these emergency situations, which I think, that's why we're here, to look and see what we can accomplish. So I didn't want this conversation to be a dead conversation where we completely close ourselves up from any possibilities. I appreciate Nevada's proposal. I do think we need to continue the conversation of what's potentially feasible before. But what I think is the challenge is that some of these questions do become a little bit more complicated. But I would encourage the conversation rather than, killing it on implementation challenges. It would be good to have a little bit more conversation on this proposal, because I think it is helpful to flesh out from other stakeholders as well as Nevada, how favorable this looks. And so I wanted to encourage that conversation as much as possible.
Thanks, Anna. Dave, did you have anything more that you'd like to say? I think not hearing anything. I see Tony Braun is next in the comment queue.
I believe the operator has unmuted me. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. I appreciate those comments, Anna. We support fully the principle that discourages leaning in the EIM, and we are sensitive to the longer-term implications of the pricing, and think that some of the arguments that have made to support the cessation of transfers, over the period of many years now, as far as the difficulty in the pricing, are legitimate. But I don't think anyone can come away from the conversations at the Market Surveillance Committee and the board with anything but a need to go back and look at revisiting that concept, at least for a short period of time. I think we're all going to have egg on our faces if we have a reliability tool that it reflects in the EIM here and we don't utilize it to solve a reliability problem. Does that mean that the pricing issues go away? No, they're still there. But I think we ought to be working really hard to see if there's an interim proposal as early as this summer that will do its best to support grid reliability while we work on the longer term challenges. And so I would greatly encourage a robust discussion of this. And if there are implementation issues or pricing and settlement issues that we don't understand, and I'm sure there are, let's get them out and get them out now, because the summer's not too far away. But I think it would be a bad result, especially after the board meeting and after the MSC discussion, if we just, generally alluded to implementation challenges and didn't go any further in detail and explanation. So we greatly appreciate that NV has put this on the table. It seems to have a lot of good concepts with it, and we ought to be giving it every chance for success.
I did want to make one clarification, because you just highlighted a note. I think that we need to be clear, Tony, and I think this is maybe a subtle thing, and maybe everybody else understands it, but I'll try to articulate the difference in terms of what the reliability issues are. I think what Danny was trying to articulate is that under the current rules, there isn't necessarily a reliability issue. There may be, sort of a concern with what's happening as to whether or not people are failing when they're in particular states of emergency. However, it isn't a concern. If we did nothing, there isn't necessarily a reliability issue. I certainly took the comments from the Board of Governors meeting to say that if we change the rules so that when you are in a state of emergency, you start limiting transfers, that could be a reliability issue. And there was concern there
not to go down a path that could potentially put us in a situation for this summer where we not knowing what the consequences are. So I think we're very well, I certainly took the mandate to come back and look at these potential changes, not imposing a reliability issue. But I think what Danny was trying to articulate earlier, which I appreciate, is that it doesn't look like we have to rush to something to avoid a reliability issue. That's what I'm understanding and hearing. I don't know if others, view this differently, because when we talk about reliability issues, it's always a little bit ambiguous. But at least from what I got back from the Board of Governors, it was clear to me that changing the current rules to be more restrictive when you're in a state of emergency was a significant concern. And that's why I appreciated Nevada's proposal, which looks at an alternative to not freeze, but to allow for the economic transfer. Now, there is a question as to whether, how quickly do we have to move into that direction? And I do think we need to be very, appreciative of there may be some limitations from an implementation perspective, but I really want to understand these proposals a little bit more fully so that we can fully explore those. But I don't know, Tony, if you see, when you think of reliability, are you concerned that under the current rules, if we did nothing, there was a reliability issue at play? I certainly didn't think so. I didn't get that from the Board of Governors meeting.
I did. I think they looked at this in a 30,000 foot level and said, we have the resources, the energy to flow, and we have a market rule that limits the flows, and otherwise it would flow. And we have this automated, smooth mechanism, and but for that limitation, you're degrading reliability because you're not using all the tools in your toolbox. That's the way I took their concerns.
Right, and that I think is with regards to general consequences of failure of the test, aside from this question of whether you should fail automatically when you're in a state of emergency. There's a distinction in my mind between those two things. I don't know, does that make sense? I don't know, Tony, if that, are you on mute or were you responding back? It's hard to tell when you...
I didn't know I was still unmuted. I don't think I have a response. I mean, we ought to be doing everything we can to support grid reliability within reason. And if we're not turning over every rock, then we're not doing all that we can do.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. And that is exactly why we took on the responsibility to look at the consequences of failure more broadly, because we do believe that promoting the market, the efficiency of the market is the ultimate goal, and that even when you're not in a state of emergency, the freezing of the transfers may not be the optimal solution here when you actually fail the test for other reasons, right? So I think that's definitely something we were wanted to consider. The proposal here does bring us a little bit more into the territory we were thinking of going into in the phase 2 discussion. But what I think we need to do is consider what, maybe we need to have that discussion sooner. So that's definitely, I appreciate your perspective that the totality of the test is really what the concern is as a whole.
Thanks, Anna. I think I wanted to jump ahead to the last slide and then open it up again for comments, because I do see there's a number of commenters in the queue. On this last slide, I do want to set reasonable expectations of what's going to be in place by summer of 2022. I think getting back to what Laura and Anna raised about should there be a trigger for automatic failure through this process, we are proposing through the BRS to at least develop the technology solution that would allow entities to notify the CAISO and have their transfers locked when they are passing the RSE and they shouldn't. I think, echoing Anna's point, we do want to turn over every rock and see what we can do, but the idea that sitting here in the last week of February, we're going to have the policy development done and go through the regulatory filing process by the start of the summer. I don't think that's feasible. That being said, I think we take everybody's concerns and comments seriously, and we'll go back internally and see what type of timeline we can broaden this discussion on. Are there any other callers in the queue? I think everybody's disappeared. Okay, I see 2 callers. If you can please keep it brief, because we're at 11:59 and we have a minute. It might be able to go a minute or 2 over, but let's try not to go too far over. So Kathleen?
Yeah, no, thanks, Danny. I just have a process question. And you may have got so quickly. Am I hearing correctly that it sounds like either we're going to start up a new project that would be dedicated to this, or we might accelerate phase 2, but that something is going to be starting to be a new stakeholder process that we should plan for starting this month? That's kind of what I'm hearing. I want to check my understanding.
And I think the answer is that's still TBD. I think we're going to look for the comments and the ideas that are offered in the comments process to this workshop, and then hopefully that will inform us and we can think about what the best path forward is on this.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kathleen. Elizabeth?
Hi, this is Libby Kirby from BPA. Sorry, my hand was up for a while and then it disappeared. Back on that ND proposal, I think BPA is really interested in that concept and is supportive of developing something like that on an expedited timeline. And I think a couple of people sort of touched on this, but I think some of the issue is we could debate implementation, through the fall, through phase 2 for quite a while and still not know exactly where these things should land. So to us, I think it makes sense that we do something reasonably fast, like ND is suggesting, and then that will give us, as we're debating this through the fall in phase 2, that will give us some actual things to point to say, in this case, it looks like this is happening all the time. $2,000 isn't enough. Or yes, you could see clearly here that it should be embedded in the LMP, not an out-of-market piece or something like that. I think Bonneville is interested in getting something in that gives us a springboard to go from.
Okay, thanks, Libby. All right, well, we are 1 minute over, and I think that this kind of concludes the workshop. Thank you, everybody, for attending and speaking up and letting us understand your perspectives and the perspectives that are important to your organizations. We will be issuing a comment template shortly, and we'll look for comments to be submitted to the ISO by the 4th of March. And I'm sure once we've had a chance to digest those, we will be having another one of these to go over what our plan would be to move forward on this topic. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you for joining today's call, and thank you for using event services. Your call has ended, and you may disconnect.